Welcome, everybody. My name is Marty Mascari, and I am a contractor with the North Central Texas Area Agency on Aging and the North Central Texas Aging and Disability Resource Center, or ADRC, both of which are under the umbrella of the North Central Texas Council of Governments in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area. We are incredibly blessed, once again, to have our partners at the James L. West Center to talk to us about sexuality and dementia. We're only going to ask one thing, is that you go to TED Talk's website after the webinar, and you please tell them they need to have Holly Glover do a TED Talk, since that's on her bucket list. I'll try to find the link to them and include it in the follow-up email, so you can all go and say that they need to have Holly do a TED Talk. Go ahead, Jamie. I'm sorry.
I love it, Marty. Thank you. So we are happy to provide CE credits for free CE credits, 1.5 credits for social work, nursing, licensed professional counselor, and certificate of attendance. We do need you to complete a SurveyMonkey evaluation form that Marty will send out in his follow-up email. We do ask that everybody complete the evaluation, whether you need the CE credits or not. We appreciate your feedback. It is valuable to us. But if you're looking for that CE credit, it is required that you complete the evaluation. We give you at least a week to complete the evaluation. So at the end of the day, on October the 18th, the evaluation and the link will close. And then we will start processing all of those CE credits. And there's a lot. So if you'll please allow us at least 4 weeks to get those back out to you in your email, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, please know, y'all, that it is quite the tedious process to get all the CEUs out. And sometimes we're short-staffed. Sometimes we just have grant deadlines or reporting deadlines that we have to meet, and so sometimes it gets pushed off just a little bit. But if you be patient, we get them out. They do get out, and I'm just starting to get caught up. So, but in addition to the SurveyMonkey, if there will also be a Google survey evaluation. And we ask that you complete that as well. That helps us report back on the goals and objectives we set forth when we applied for the funding to do these. One last point is, please know that we have to have a record that you joined us. And that record is a Zoom report that we get that tells us who joined and for how long they joined, because we need to know you were on for the whole time. Please note that you need to get your own registration and log in under your own registration to get that. If you're logged in under someone else's registration, it will not show you on the Zoom report as having attended, and that creates a problem for us with our records. I'm going to turn it over to Holly Glover.
Thank you. Well, we are glad to have you here today. I see we've got 128 right now, and I'm sure that will be growing. We're going to talk about sexuality and dementia. This one in our program that we do on Hospice 101, we usually have a lot of questions, so I'll try to make sure and have some time at the end and hopefully cover everything that you may want to know about this topic today. Here's some information about us at the James L. West Center in Fort Worth. There's my information for those of you that are getting CEs and our educational objectives, of course. Those of you that are with us regularly know I am certainly not one to read the screen to you, because I have sat through too many when people do that and am trying to doze off. There's a couple of things on here, though, as we get started, that I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page as far as definitions go whenever it comes to sexuality and dementia. First of all, I want us to think about that word intimacy, because you're going to hear me use the word intimacy an awful lot as we're talking about sexuality and dementia. But look at what the word actually means. It's an act or expression that serves as a token of, and look what this key word, familiarity. Think about what's going on in the brain of somebody with dementia. Those of you who've been on with us before, those of you who work in the field, or even family members, we know their brain is beginning to fail. They're going to go throughout the course of this disease from a 3-pound brain down to a 1-pound brain. They are going to hold on to every connection that they can and everything that feels familiar. So keep that in mind. We're talking about intimacy, familiarity. Then there's sexual intimacy. But there's all different types of sexual intimacy. Sexual intimacy can be laying in the bed together. It can be hugging, it can be kissing, it can be holding hands. It can be all sensual activities. It's not just intercourse, which is what a lot of people misunderstand as sexual intimacy. Now, we also need to understand these two terms as well, which is sexual abuse and sexual assault, what the difference is, sexual abuse and sexual assault. Because as we start talking about capacity with people who have dementia, we've really got to think about them being able to consent. So sexual abuse, the definition is any form of non-consensual contact. And that can be all types of things, including touching, rape, sodomy, sexual coercion, explicit photographs, harassment. That's sexual abuse. Sexual assault, the definition for sexual assault, is non-consensual, it's unwanted sexual contact that warrants medical treatment. So there's the difference in some of the terms. So I want us to think about, and I'm going to approach this from a couple of different ways. We're going to talk about it through the eyes of a partner, and we're also going to talk about it through the eyes of a healthcare worker, because I know we have both on the program today, and I know some of you are both, that you are doing this at home as well as doing this in your professional life. This is interesting when you really get to looking into it and study it. And this very first bullet point, there is an article that was put out by the Family Caregiver Alliance, and it talks about the fact that in doctors' offices, with all professionals that we deal with our loved one that has dementia, rarely does intimacy come up. Because it's like sexuality and those who are over a certain age is almost taboo. I'm not going to talk about it. Just like it doesn't exist. And we are going to look at some numbers, some statistics that show that, of course, it exists. It most definitely exists. We're sexual beings. We all are. And that doesn't go away just because somebody develops dementia. It's really, really a difficult struggle, not only for the person with dementia, but also for their partner. And we're going to talk through some of those feelings, and we're actually going to talk through how a lot of it results in grief. It's part of the grief that a partner goes through. It's part of the grief that a person with dementia goes through as well. It's common for both people, the person living with dementia and the partner, to go through guilt, anger, rejection, and shame about their changing feelings. And we're going to talk about why that is. And it's very, very hard not to take these things personally, of course. And it feels very, very lonely. This is a lonely disease. And we'll talk about people that you can talk to about these things. This is probably the number one topic that people stay after programs to talk with me about one-on-one, because they don't feel comfortable asking in a class. They don't feel comfortable asking in a group or in front of other people. And I'll tell you where it usually happens is at churches. Whenever I go out and I'm talking to groups at churches, inevitably, I'll have somebody stay afterwards, and they just have a lot of questions. And a lot of times their questions are about their own feelings. And it ends with, is this normal? Is what I'm feeling normal? So we'll talk through some of that today. One thing I want us to understand, whether you're in a relationship with somebody who has dementia or whether you are a healthcare professional, the way that an adult child views sexuality and dementia and the way that the partner of somebody with dementia views it is going to be two completely different topics. Some of the hardest discussions and some family mediations that I've had over the years have dealt with this. Where I'll give you an example, an adult son and his wife, the mother has been placed, the father is still living and was the primary caregiver whenever she was still at home, and he is struggling with her placement. He is just struggling with his wife's dementia. They have been married 60 plus years. And the adult son, now that she's placed, is so aggravated and mad at his dad for not just allowing the staff at the facility to just kind of take over. And he's not understanding. He even used the words, and I know he didn't mean get over it, but those are the words that came out of his mouth. We know she's okay now. We know she's being fed. We know she's being bathed. We know she's getting her meds. Dad, could you just get over it? Come on. And the dad looked at the son and said, you don't understand. This is my wife. She is not just your mother. That's powerful. And it took me stepping in and saying to the adult son, what if today, because his wife was sitting there, what if today you found out that your wife that you've been married to for 20 years, 25 years, has a progressive terminal illness, and eventually she may not know you by name. You may not be able to take care of her. And that adult son said to me, that is completely different. That's not the same thing. I said, it's exactly the same thing. Your daddy loves your mama just like you love your wife. He was passionately in love with her as a young woman, and they had children together, and they've grown old together, but you're viewing him as your parent. And when it came to intimacy, the adult son was kind of la, 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 la. It's not happening, or it shouldn't happen. And he would kind of scold his dad for laying in the bed with his mama and staying late in the night until she was content. And it took, with compassion, me pointing out that your daddy and your mama are just the same as you and your wife. So keeping that in mind also, healthcare workers, depending on who we're talking to, if we're talking to adult children or if we're talking to the partner, everybody's going through grief, but it's going to look very different. So let's look at starting to cope with these changes. It's interesting, the article that I was looking at earlier about that we don't discuss intimacy with healthcare professionals, but think about sexuality in a relationship. It's how we stay connected. It's one of the ways that we remain close. And it's also one of the things that can bring comfort to a couple. Because even if nothing else is going right, even if there are troubles at work, or there's trouble with the kids, or there's whatever's going on in the world, when somebody has been together for a very long time, many times that's the one place that they connect. It brings pleasure. It makes us both feel good. It's familiar. And that doesn't just go away because somebody develops dementia. However, it does change things. The caregiver has a very, very stressful job And that's what it is. It's a job. Because you, as the care partner, are the one who's accommodating the disease. Your loved one can't. And in the support groups, we talk a lot, especially in our support group we have that's specific to grief. We talk a lot about loss. And we actually have done some exercises where we list all of the things that we have lost due to this disease. And the sexual relationship is part of that. It changes. And there's grief over that. And again, keep in mind, we're talking about the intimacy and the connection. It's an intimacy and connection that is shared only by partners, that nobody else understands. This is the only person that they've shared that part of their life with. It doesn't matter how many people they've been with before. We're talking about in dementia, in the moment. This is their person that they're losing. And when I mean their person, think about those nicknames we have for each other. Their honey, their sweetheart, their sugar, their baby, their sweetie, their whatever it is. It's passion. And it's changing. Now, some of the things that we know that changes, especially early in the disease when somebody is diagnosed, is self-esteem. They know that something's wrong, even if they never fully come out and say the words, I realize I have dementia, because that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't happen very often. They're out of control. They're scared. They can be very depressed. And low self-esteem comes right along with that. So there's the person with dementia. They're starting to become depressed. They're starting to feel maybe worthless, like they can't do the things that they used to be able to do. And at the same time, what's going on with the caregiver? The caregiver may be getting so involved in what has to take place for a caregiver that they actually start to pull away emotionally and physically because of the demands of being a caregiver, even when it's not intended. We're getting frustrated because they're asking the same question over and over and over again. We're not fully understanding the disease yet. They're having these expressions or behaviors that we don't understand, and we may find ourselves as that care partner pulling away from the very person that we always went to. And so there's changes in the emotional connection, and there's changes in the sexual desire. It's very normal. Again, one of the most often asked questions, is this normal? Is this a normal feeling? Yes, it is. Of course it is. But does that make it easy to deal with? No. It's one of those aspects that who would stop to think that we'd have to deal with this? It's even been said, some caregivers will say that the role of being an intimate partner just completely fades away, because their identity, and those of you that are on who are care partners, may be at the very place right now where you will even say that your identity has become caregiver. And it's how you identify yourself. Your role changes from being their partner, being their spouse, to being their caregiver. And of course, that changes your sexual relationship with them. You may have fewer sexual feelings. You may have no sexual feelings. And then comes the guilt. It's also okay to have those feelings that are conflicting. Now, let's look at some of the facts. This is interesting. 1/3 of 80-year-olds still have sex. 1/3 of 80-year-olds still have sex. 60% of healthcare workers, however, stated These are people who work in healthcare with people with dementia, that sexuality is just not necessary. It just should be something that doesn't happen. And sexuality often gets labeled as a behavior in memory care. And again, those of you who've been doing programs with us for a while know that we're working very hard at the West Center to move away from the word behavior and move toward expressions. And the staff may overreact, and sometimes they're overreacting because of their own sexual history. Now, just a couple of things that I want to share, and throughout the course of this, I'll share some personal stories of things that I've seen over my career. I had a gentleman in the day program who every time I'd go over there, he would be very suggestive with his words with me. He was flirting, is exactly what he was doing. And I knew him well. I knew his wife, and I knew what worked with him. And I would hold my hand up and show him my wedding ring and say to him, we'll call him Bill, Bill, would you look at that ring right there? I don't think my husband's going to like that very much. And every time he'd say, your husband doesn't have to know. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to distract away from that. I didn't scold him. I didn't get on to him. I just go, come on, let's get in here and get us something to eat. I think there's some coffee. I believe over here we're starting to, and I would distract him away. Now, you notice in that second picture there, the way the gentleman is hugging, got his hand up there. That's something else that I work with students on, about being careful about those frontal hugs, especially. We're going to look at some percentages of what do these behaviors, what do these expressions look like. And sometimes it's just, if I get a chance to feel something, it's right there, I'm going to go ahead and take that. I always tell students, do the side hug if you're going to do the hug. Is that sexual? We'll talk about why. Now, we've said before, sexuality is a continuing human need. It is common in all people. We don't have a whole lot of change. There's some change, but not a whole lot of change as far as intimacy goes. And think about this. We discussed that brain, that 3-pound brain's going down to a 1-pound brain. How are we going to expect them to act like the person with the 3-pound brain? How are we going to expect them to be able to express their sexual needs like someone with a 3-pound brain? How are we going to expect a person with dementia whose filter is dying to be able to express themselves in a socially appropriate way? The filter is the part of the brain that says, do this, don't do that. Say this, don't say that. And it's dying. But I'm still having these feelings. So they'll say and do things they never would have said or done in places they never would have said or done. This is in all of the dementias. We know there's over 130 different types of dementia. Now, we do see it more often in frontotemporal and in Lewy body, but it can be in vascular, it can be in Alzheimer's, it can be in Parkinson's, it can be in any type of dementia, but it's more common in FTD and in Lewy body. Notice I also have on there, it is okay to have a sexual relationship with your loved one who has dementia in ways that you are both comfortable. We'll talk more about that as well. So here's some facts I wanted us to look at, and this came from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. I think it's interesting. I always like putting in some statistics so we get an idea of what we're talking about. 46% of men and 18% of women in the early stages of dementia and mild cognitive impairment, so MCI is also included, report that they are sexually active. Now, same survey, 77% report sexual dysfunction. And in men, 55% of that was erectile dysfunction, and 60% in women was just decreased desire. 10% of people in this survey said that they felt sexually threatened, and 17% reported feeling obligated to engage in sexual activities. We're really going to talk about that more. That feeling of obligation, why it comes up, why partners do it, and why it's there. You probably already are figuring that out. We mentioned earlier that low self-esteem, but this is a place where I feel comfortable. This is something I know and have known for a very long time with you, my partner. I'm early in the disease, and it makes me feel good. And a lot of times the partners feel like they are obligated. Let's talk about the word consent, because this comes up a lot whenever we're talking about dementia. The capacity of a person with dementia to consent to sexual intimacy is central to all discussion about sexuality. In the Oxford psychiatry, they have in their studies that a person has capacity throughout the early stages of the disease, but that once they reach the moderate stages of the disease, that they no longer have capacity. That is their opinion. We're going to look at some other opinions about consent. But what is functional competence? Functional competence means that they can make a decision and that they understand the consequences of that decision. I like that a little bit better. Physical arousal alone is not consent. Physical arousal alone is not consent. Part of dementia is also apathy. Part of dementia is that the person who has dementia no longer recognizes the needs of other people around them. They can become very self-centered. This is really, really difficult when this is your spouse, this is your partner. It's what they want and what they need, and it's usually right now that they expect it. Now, when you put that together with sexuality, you can see where there are partners who just kind of give in to this and go, okay, if that will keep them calm, if that will make them happy, if that will make them. However, nobody should be forced into any sexual or intimate activity that they're not comfortable with. Now, as a partner, you should feel confident that you can recognize nonverbal consent before you start any sexual activity. You should never initiate sexual activity without a clear consent, and you must stop at any sign of reluctance. They should be able to demonstrate the ability to make choices and to appreciate sexual activity and what it is that's happening. This all came from Alzheimer's.org. It's a great place to get more information about this. So let's look more at that word capacity. Most people believe, most centers, most facilities, it's going to change as the disease progresses. And not only is it going to change as the disease progresses, it's going to change from time to time. It's going to change from person to person. It's going to change from place to place. Excuse me. It also has to be in the absence of coercion. Sorry, let me grab a drink. It has to be in the absence of delusion. Sorry. and they have to understand the sexual activity that's taking place. They also have to be able to express an interest in the activity. And some of the things that we have to step back and think about is, are the residents, if these are our residents, are they misidentifying each other? Do they think this is their spouse? Do they think this is their boyfriend or girlfriend? Can they state what level of sexual intimacy that they are comfortable with? Some of the things that I've talked with partners about or spouses about is to think back throughout the course of their relationship together and the nature of the relationship and their sexual preferences throughout the course of the relationship. If they are suddenly talking about or wanting to do things that they have never brought up before, something just comes out of the blue that they've never mentioned before, that may be indicative of impaired capacity. And if the person is completely inactive, the sexual activity should stop. Unequal relationships are reason for concern. And this is after placement, because there are most definitely, and we're going to talk about a couple of really good movies that you can watch about this. We will most definitely see people after placement develop relationships. But how many times is it actually sexual? It may be intimate, and that's almost always what it's about. Sometimes it isn't. But we also want to look and see where each of the people are in the disease. Again, we'll talk more about that. Now, keep in mind also that there's a difference in being impulsive. There's a difference in a behavior or an expression, and there's a difference in a relationship. So impulsive, a behavior, or a relationship. Let's look at some misconceptions that can actually increase caregiver stress. These are myths. All of these on this page are myths. And I looked these up. Myths about caregiver stress with sexuality. The elderly have little or no interest in sex, and sexuality just does not exist. Well, whenever you are maybe looking something up on our friend Dr. Google, and you see something like that, that's why so many times people will come and say, oh my gosh, I'm not normal. These feelings I'm having aren't normal because I still want to be sexually active with my loved one. That is normal. Women are unable to have orgasms after menopause. That's a myth. The idea of sexuality in the aged is shameful and perverse. Frail old people will get hurt having sex. Caregivers' needs or distress are signs of selfishness or incompetence, and all the caregiver's energy should go toward the patient or the person with dementia. Here's some more misconceptions or myths. It is not okay to have sex with someone with dementia. The person with dementia is a stranger. The person with dementia seems to forget that the partner is there or how to make love. A caregiver should be able to assume all required tasks and responsibilities. Those are all myths. Now, there are times, however, that the spirit is willing, that maybe we really would like to engage in some type of sexual activity with our loved one, or they would like to with us. However, there's some health-related factors such as diabetes or hypertension or depression, a hormone imbalance, prostate problems. All of those can affect sexual desire with or without dementia. Heart disease, osteoporosis, arthritis, incontinence, emphysema. All of these, again, can affect sexual desire. Side effects of medications, fear of heart attack, and it may just not be as gratifying, or it may feel very awkward. Now, I want to share this quote that I found because I thought this makes a lot of sense, especially in the direction that we're going with what we're talking about with sexuality and dementia. As people age, they do not lose their need to intimacy. And in fact, because of losses due to nursing home placement, declining health, and lifestyle changes, the need for intimacy may be even greater. An intimate relationship with another resident can enhance self-esteem and well-being. That sentence, an intimate relationship with another resident can enhance their self-esteem. We talked about that earlier. And well-being. Intimacy. That need to be with someone who's familiar. Let's look at the most common changes that we see in sexuality and dementia. Most common changes: a decrease in or a loss in interest in sexual activity, or, as we mentioned earlier, awkwardly conducted, or maybe the sequences out of order of sexual activity. They may have requests for forms of sexual behaviors that they've not ever asked for before. We mentioned that apathy earlier, that lack of consideration for the responses or the needs or the satisfaction of the partner. And then this is really common, to make false sexual allegations. Let's think about why this happens. This is most common after somebody is placed. Many of you who work in healthcare have been hearing the term trauma-informed care for a while now. You've heard us talk about, and hopefully you've heard about, the theory of retrogenesis, where a person with dementia is literally going back. They're going back in time. They're going back through all the events of their life. And in that theory of retrogenesis, if there was trauma, it's highly likely that that trauma will come back. And if there was any type of sexual trauma, unfortunately, it can show back up. So here's a perfect example. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, where in the night, the caregivers go in to check on or to change the brief of someone who's in bed, and maybe they startled them or they woke them up, and they may make a sexual allegation. Someone raped me, someone touched me. Three-pound brain going down to a 1-pound brain. It's nighttime, I'm confused, I'm asleep, and someone comes in and they're taking off my clothes and they're touching me in places you can see where this would happen. Even if you're explaining what you're doing the whole time. A 1-pound brain or a 2-pound brain that's lost the ability to be reasonable and rational, and I've got trauma in my past. Especially if the person who is doing the care is of the same sex as the person who was their abuser. I had a resident who got to where she was pushing all her furniture up against the door at night. She had a male caregiver at night. We didn't know that there'd been any trauma because the family had not shared that there'd been any trauma. I called the adult son and asked him, do you know of anything that may have happened? He didn't. But when he called his aunt, his mother's sister, she was able to tell him that when they both were little girls, there were some things that happened that they never talked about again. And it was happening to her again. And she was doing all she knew to do, was to push the furniture against the door. And that was an easy fix. We switched caregivers. It was because it was a male coming in the night. But we didn't know that. That's what trauma-informed care is. That's knowing somebody's past. Let's look at what can be called inappropriate sexual behaviors or expressions. Now, please keep these numbers in mind. Only 28% of people with dementia will ever have an inappropriate sexual behavior, and it typically can be managed with behavioral measures. Okay, so hear that again. Out of everybody with dementia, only 28% of people with dementia are going to have inappropriate sexual behaviors. But of those 28%, this is what we're likely to see. About 85% of those 28% will do things like touching, hugging, or kissing strangers. And that can be labeled as inappropriate sexual behavior. Now, if you're an expert in this field, you know that is not an inappropriate sexual behavior. That's an expression. And that is something that we can understand why they're doing that. Maybe they're not being touched at all except for care, because you know we do that. As somebody with dementia continues to progress through the disease, we don't touch them except for when we're assisting at mealtime, or we're helping them get dressed, or we're in the bathroom, or we're doing a shower, or we're shaving. Where's the intimate touching? It tends to go away. So they'll do it themselves. So they may touch, hug, or kiss strangers. That's the most common. 50% of those 28% will undress in public. Now, again, is that really sexual? Think about all of the reasons why somebody who has dementia might undress in a public place. Go back and remember, we've got the 3-pound brain. Theirs is going to a 1-pound brain. We can be reasonable and rational. They cannot. And I'm hot in this room. I believe I'll just start taking off my clothes because I don't have the ability to be reasonable and say, could somebody change the air? Or could I put on a different shirt? This bra strap is really twisted and it's bothering me, or I've got a tag back here. I'm just going to take this off. It doesn't have anything to do with being sexual. It's because I'm uncomfortable. 7% of the 28% will use sexually laden language. Again, each of these is more common in frontotemporal dementia or in Lewy body dementia, but they can show up in any of the dementias. Suggestive behavior or language, what my friend Bill used to do with me would probably fall under this category of suggestive behaviors. But it's all in how we handle it. And most of the time it can be managed with behavioral measures. We're going to talk about other things we might have to do. Now, 40% of that 28% can become aggressive and have repeated sexual overtures. 25% expose themselves, and most of the time that's during personal care. So let's think about why that happens. I always remind our staff about this. Today's youth, today's generation, today's young people have walked around showing their bodies for a very long time because that's kind of become normal to walk around without many clothes on. Most people who have dementia, let's just say 60 and over, and we know there's people with dementia much younger than that, but let's just say 60 and over, didn't spend the majority of their life walking around with very few clothes on. And how many people have actually seen them with no clothes on, and it's just me and you, their spouse, any other sexual partners they may have had, the doctor, their parents when they were little. And here you are taking my clothes off. Well, what does my brain that's beginning to atrophy think is about to happen, especially if you are of the opposite sex? Reasonable and rational. Masturbating in public, 16% of those 28%. When we talk about sexual behaviors or sexual expressions, there's actually 3 types. There's appropriate behaviors, there's ambiguous behaviors. Keeping in mind, ambiguous means it's open to more than one interpretation. And then there's inappropriate. When you look up, when you study, when you are doing research on inappropriate sexual behaviors with dementia, this is what comes up. And again, I think it's important, and that's why I moved that number up to the top, that only 28% of the time are we going to see it. Now, when you're in the middle of being one of those 28% of the time, it feels like it may be never going to end, but it does. It is a phase, just like all of the other behaviors or expressions are a phase. Why is it happening? There's changes going on in their brain. Not only is their brain beginning to shrink or atrophy, they're having chemical changes as well. And it is not something that they can control. It does not mean that we can talk louder or slower to them and that they can control it. If they could, they would. So how do we respond to some of these behaviors or expressions? We're never going to scold, shame, or ridicule. I always encourage those primary caregivers to keep a journal, keep a notebook with you so that we can look at all behaviors, all expressions, and try to figure out what's triggered it. Is it a time of day? Is it a lighting issue? Is it something I'm wearing or the other person is wearing? Is it something on TV? There's a lot of these that we can ignore. There's a lot of these that we can find a way to kind of, just like my friend that I'd tell him, oh, my husband isn't going to like that. Come on, let's get in here and get us a cinnamon roll. We did that every day until we didn't, because eventually he stopped asking. You may get to the point when your loved one is at home that you might sleep in separate rooms, or you may sleep apart, or, this is very common, to have separate beds in the same room. You can also use delay tactics. So when we're talking about behaviors or expressions, we always teach validate, fix, distract. Validate the feeling, then fix whatever it is, then distract. So absolutely, we're going to do that. I would like to do that too, but I was about to get some ice cream. A person with dementia can have one thought at a time. And if we can get that thought off of this over onto that, it delays and it buys us some time. Now, temporarily, we may have to use some medications, and I've got a list. We're going to go through those medications and why we would use them. And that word temporarily is on there for a reason, because this is a phase. There may be times, depending on what's going on, that we may have to stop unsupervised visits with children or with vulnerable adults, depending again with what's going on. Some of the things that we can start to do, though, is to use touch in our everyday routine. Make sure that they are being touched, and it's not just for ADLs. Connect. Keep the connection, keep the familiarity, stay intimate. We're also going to see a list of ways to remain intimate. But don't just touch them when it's time to change clothes. Validation therapy, that's where you're not questioning their feelings, you're accepting their feelings, even if you don't agree with it. I've got on there again, not to overreact or be shocked. Don't try to reason or be rational. Be sensitive and reassuring, and then redirect to a private area if we need to. Now, let me share a couple more stories. I had an adult son in my office, tears streaming down his face. He said, "You're never going to believe what my mama just said to me." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "Well, she was suggesting that we have babies together." The first thing I asked him, allowing him to have his feelings too, was, "Do you look like your daddy?" And he said, "I look exactly like my dad. I'm a spitting image of my dad." And I said, "Where were you just visiting with your mom?" "We were sitting on her bed." "You looked like your daddy and you were sitting on the bed." She's got dementia. She sees her young husband and she wants to have babies. She wasn't talking to her son. She was talking to her husband. And that was very appropriate for her to say to her husband. It was very upsetting for an adult son to have his mother come on to him. But it was education. And talking to him about, let's not visit mom in the bedroom anymore. Let's make sure every time you come to visit, because if we were visiting her at home, would you sit in the bedroom? No, you'd sit in the living room. You might go outside. You'd sit in the kitchen. You'd go and you might do something. You'd bring her a treat. But we wouldn't even give that the opportunity to come up and continue to call her mom, use your own name. And allow him to understand why it happened. Something else we might see. I had a woman who had moved in, and every night she got up and got in bed with a man. And our staff would find her in bed with a man every single night. She would get in bed with somebody and just be curled up. They'd be spooning together. And I actually had somebody use the word that she was having a sexual behavior. There was no sexual behavior going on. Her husband had just died. That's why she came to live with us. She had slept in the bed next to a man for over 50 years. She was finding a man and getting in bed with him. There was nothing sexual going on. Was there intimacy? Yes. Closeness, feeling safe, feeling secure. Education to families, education to staff, education to associates. That wasn't sexual. Now, I mentioned medication earlier, so let's look at the medications that might be used. Most of us know that the majority of medications, even if it says that they're labeled as an antidepressant, they may be used for many different things. For example, I'm thinking of a medication that's used as an appetite stimulant, but it's also an antidepressant. So many antidepressants will bring down a level of cognitive arousal. So they may use an antidepressant if somebody is becoming hypersexual. They may use an antipsychotic because it may help reduce some acting out behaviors, as well as some anticonvulsants because they've got different uses. This is where we don't want to scare ourselves with the Dr. Google. Then there's the memory meds. I've got that in quotes. That's the Aricept, Namenda, Exelon. And again, we know those aren't memory meds. Those are symptom meds. And many of those will help with some sexual behaviors or expressions. And then with men, we sometimes can use female hormones and it will reduce their testosterone levels. Now, but with women, we can't do that because if you give a woman female hormones, they tend to get worse. You give them male hormones, they might get mean. So that doesn't always work with women, but with men, I've seen it many, many times where they give them a low dose of a female hormone, goes away. That's that. And again, temporary. These are temporary. some management tips that we might try, some environmental modifications that we may have to do. We need to be watching to see if they're understimulated. Are they bored? Is that why they're doing some of this? Because they're bored? Are they uncomfortable in their clothing or the temperature of the room? Is it always directed at the same person? We might check that as well. So many times what they're seeking is physical touch. They may just need something to hold. They make the robotic dogs and pets where they can sit and stroke or hold or pet a dog or a cat. So some type of an animal, a stuffed animal. Now, occasionally, from time to time, we may have to use some adaptive clothing. And I've got a picture there of some adaptive clothing. This particular outfit came from a site called Buck and Buck. There's many out there, though. You can just go to Amazon and put in adaptive clothing. And what it is it's clothing. It looks like regular clothing, but they button up the back or they zip up the back. What we don't want to have happen. We don't want to have this happen. True story. Miss Holly, oh my God, come quick. He's on top of her. What do we do? Come running into my office. Housekeeping came running into my office. And I got up and I walked around, and sure enough, he was laying on top of her, fully clothed. They're just kind of making out there in the bed. And the first thing I said, because I've been working in this a long time and I know a lot of therapeutic stories, was, they just called your name for your dinner reservation. Come on. It's time for y'all's table. Let's go. They both jumped up and came right with me. Didn't scold him, didn't get on to him. It was almost like I just found them and they just called your name for your table. Come on, let's go. Didn't say anything about what was going on. We got to teach our staff. Don't overreact. Understand. It's normal. It's intimacy. It might not be sexual. What's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Now let's think through, is it really sexual? Or what might cause this to happen? Seen this happen also. It's late at night. Caregiver goes in to check on somebody, and the caregiver has on a little bit of a low-cut scrubs. It's a V-neck, and she has large breasts. And she reaches over the resident to adjust the covers that are on the bed. And he reached up and grabbed her breast. It's nighttime. It's dark. There's breast in my face. Think about it. I've got a brain that's beginning to atrophy. I can't be reasonable and rational. Is that sexual? Is it environmental? It's an easy fix. We've talked about why somebody might take their clothes off. People may take their clothes off as they're walking down the hall on their way to the bathroom, or they may come out of the bathroom with no clothes on at all. Fondling their genitals. Seen this happen over and over again, where staff or associates might be going, they're masturbating right out there in the middle of, and then we might get to checking, and oh my goodness, they've got this horrible rash. He's got a rash around his testicles. That's what was going on. Sometimes that's what it is. But I don't have the ability to be reasonable or rational, or even the capacity to say, I'm really hurting down here, but I can have my hand in my pants and be touching. The misinterpreting cues from others, that goes back to the caregiver leaning over. maybe thinking it was their partner, ADL time we've mentioned, or just expressing that need for affection. I'm going to make a couple of movie recommendations that I mentioned earlier. The first one is this one that you can see. It's the Glenn Campbell story that's called I'll Be Me. It was a documentary. His family was fantastic about letting them follow him around that last year that he was on tour. And they show the good, the bad, and the ugly about this. We actually have done a showing of this a couple of different times at places that I've worked, because his family allowed us to see dementia. And there's a time that they change his medication and he becomes hypersexual, and his wife addresses it in the movie. She goes back to the doctor and they take the camera in with the doctor, because again, it's a documentary, and says, he's wearing me out. You got to do something, because he's wanting to touch and hold and kiss and stroke and be touching her all the time. But they address it. Where he became overly interested in sex. And with him, it actually was something to do with medication. Again, sometimes medication has to be used, but sometimes medication just has to be changed. That's what they were actually able to do with him. So I recommend that. I think it's on Amazon for like $5. It's very, very cheap. Some of the things for us to keep in mind also, that the person with dementia is losing the awareness of their own needs. And they're losing the awareness of the wishes of others, like we mentioned before. They no longer understand the consequences of their actions. I had a family whose father got to where he liked to sit in his chair in his room with no clothes on. And they would get very upset when they would come and he would not have any clothes on. He'd have a blanket over him. And they had the kids with them. They had the grandkids with them. It was temporary. It was just what he was wanting to do in that moment. He was in his room. He put a blanket over him. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Why was he doing it? He has dementia. It was just part of what he was doing for that time. And they were getting upset with us because, but I've got my grandkids and Dad's sitting there and he's naked in a chair. He's got a blanket over him. Why didn't he have his clothes on? Well, he was in his room and he has the right to sit there in his chair with no clothes on, with the blanket over him. If he chooses to, education, this took a lot of education with the family. It was gone as fast as it came. Helping the family to understand the disease process. I want us to look at the 5 components of intimacy. Throughout the course of the disease, all the way until end of life, non-sexual forms of intimacy are going to remain very important because connection remains important. We teach connection, validation therapy, compassionate communication, all the way through the end of life. The ability to feel close and to stay connected to other people remains because that's controlled by the amygdala in the brain, and the amygdala remains. The hippocampus is dying, but the amygdala remains. So they need to feel close. So when we hear that word intimacy, here's the components of intimacy. The desire to remain together permanently. That's what a commitment is. That's why so many times, even at the end of the disease, the very last stages, when there's no language, maybe there's 5 words left, a partner or spouse can put their forehead right on the forehead of their loved one and connect in a way that nobody else can connect. The emotional depth and closeness shared by a couple. That's intimacy. Now, when someone's been a couple for a very long time, they also have something called cognitive intimacy. And that's where we have some shared thinking. We have shared information, we have shared values, and we have shared goals within the relationship. And that's part of what that caregiving spouse will start to grieve the loss of. My other half, my stabilizer, and they can't play that role anymore. Of course, there's physical intimacy. And again, we encourage our loved ones, we encourage our residents, our families, lay in the bed with your loved one, lay in the bed with your husband, your wife, your mama or your daddy. Hold them, put your arms around them, put your head on their chest. And mutuality. That mutual interaction and exchange of energy for the maintenance of the relationship. Marriage therapy, relationship therapy, that's the give and the take. The give and the take. That remains. I've seen it over and over and over again. I've seen a person well into the dementia have their loved one come up and hug them, put their forehead on their forehead, and then react to that with them in a way that they don't react with other people. Because that stays. It's the ability to feel close and to stay connected. Other ways to remain intimate. There's some things that we can do to remain intimate that don't have anything to do with intercourse. Just sitting together and holding hands, or touching, or hugging, or kissing, or just laying together like the picture there. Putting lotion on someone, combing and brushing their hair, dancing. And we know that dementia loves to dance. Doing range of motion exercises together where you're touching and holding each other. Doing manicures and pedicures and not making it about the task, but making it about the connection. I had a gentleman earlier this year whose very young wife was first diagnosed at 48. He mentioned in a support group that some of the most intimate times they had was at mealtime. Because he came every night to assist her with dinner. And he said, I just don't know how to explain it. Nobody's going to understand this unless they've lived it. That is some of the most intimate times I've ever had with her is at mealtime. And I watched it, I saw it, and it most definitely was. Bathing and showering, massage, making sure that they know they are safe, that assurance. So much that comes in for the partner is the guilt, as he or she doesn't recognize me as their partner. This is where support groups really come in, because they may not be able to call you their wife or husband. In fact, they may call you the nurse. They may call you something else. I've shared the story of the man who looked his wife in the face and said, that's not my wife, that's the nurse. My wife has red hair. His wife had very white hair now, but in his mind, where he was, his wife had red hair. So she was the nurse, because everything she was doing for him, she felt like the nurse. There are many books and websites on this subject. You can go to allsconnected.org and find it. I've got a great resource page at the end of this program. We'll talk about it also. And I cannot stress enough about being as a support group, just to be with other people. You don't have to say a word, but sometimes just listening to others and finding out I'm not the only one who has these feelings goes a long, long way. We've got online support groups. We also have in person. I can help you find a support group in your area if you can't find one. Talk to your primary care physician, a social worker, a counselor, your clergy. It doesn't have to be somebody who can fix it, because they probably can't fix it. They probably aren't going to have all the answers. But sometimes as a caregiver, we just need someone safe to hear us. Because this is grief. We're going through grief. We're going through ambiguous grief because we're losing someone who's still very much alive. So let's talk about this as well. Dementia and forming new relationships after placement. What must be considered? Here's another movie I'm going to recommend. It is called Away from Her. It is very loosely based on what happened with Sandra Day O'Connor and her husband. She wrote a beautiful story, an article about she placed her husband in a facility and he found a girlfriend. And she wrote an article, if I remember right, in the article or in the subtitle, something that said, I lost my husband to love, to dementia and to love. And she would go to visit him and actually sit at the back of the room and watch him interact with another woman. And that's what happens in this story. But they do it the opposite. The woman has dementia and the husband goes and watches her. This is one of the biggest concerns of family members. So again, highly recommend this. What's interesting is since that time, Sandra Day O'Connor's husband passed away, and in 2018, she was diagnosed with dementia and was moved into an assisted living. So think about whenever somebody with dementia is placed, they do still have the right to form new relationships. What they're usually looking for is reassurance and comfort, and what families will sometimes do is come up and demand, keep that woman away from my daddy. Education. Us as professionals being able to sit back and take the emotion out of it, but meet them with compassion. And we have to look at a lot of things. Do they think that this is their spouse? Can they state what they're comfortable doing? What do their behaviors look like? Do they have the ability to communicate? I had a couple who was placed with us, and they both had dementia. The man died. I was in the room when he died. I was in the room sitting with the wife when he died. She went to his funeral. Within a week, she had found a new man that she was pushing around in the wheelchair and calling by the name of her husband, and that man was answering her. It wasn't his name. We'll use Bill again. She found Bill, and she pushed Bill all around, and he would answer her, and she was taking care of him. And her boys were so mad because we just buried Dad. What is she doing with this other man? What is she doing with him? She's taking care of him. She's been taking care of a man for 60 years. And she found a man to take care of. It wasn't sexual. It was intimate. And I talked with the man's family. And it ended up being something really beautiful. But boy, did we have to all get on the same page to understand what was happening. What can happen with the spouse, that caregiver? It's called social limbo. I've even heard the term single spouse. I'm married, but I'm single. Because I still get invited to things. I still get invited to Christmas parties, but my loved one's placed. And everybody else is in couples and I'm alone. But I'm married. Ambiguous grief, mourning the loss of someone who's alive. Other issues that can come up with spouses is, am I taking advantage of my spouse if I initiate sex with them? And we've talked about what that should look like. feeling guilty about their feelings that they're having themselves, or if they seek companionship and relief from loneliness. And then we've mentioned caregivers admitting to using sex to calm down their spouses when they're agitated. But then there's no emotion and there's no passion, and they find themselves feeling very used and even degraded. These are some of the most common things that we'll see among those caregivers that are partners of somebody with dementia. I do want us here at the end to look at a couple of things. This is the Texas Health and Human Service System. If you're not in Texas, your state is probably very similar, and it's some things that we need to understand. This is about resident rights. A person who is placed still has the right to be sexual as long as it's not in public, a public display, but they can most definitely be in their room, just like the gentleman I mentioned sitting in his chair with no clothes on. Was that even sexual? I don't think it was, but he had the right to do that. Is consensual. They must have the mental capacity to make the decision and be on the same cognitive level between the residents. So we cannot have somebody who's in the early stages with somebody who's in the very, very late stages. Capacity is not the same, and it doesn't harm the resident or others. Now, what's the staff responsibilities? We've got to have some policies and procedures to take into consideration for the residents' rights, protect the residents from harm, of course, document observations of sexual expression, report information regarding the residents' sexual expression to the family members that are required. And again, this is being very compassionate and using education, and provide the resident with privacy. Now, I did this talk earlier this year in Oklahoma, and I pulled this from the Oklahoma Ombudsman. Now, again, in your state, your ombudsman, your rules are going to be very, very similar, if not exactly the same. And what do we use them for? Each state has their ombudsman, and we can call them to resolve complaints, to have them check in on the well-being of our residents who are placed, but they are also there to educate about rights. So if there's ever a question about sexuality, an ombudsman can be called as well. They provide information to the public about nursing homes and assisted livings and facilities and residents' rights and policies, but they are also there to advocate for the resident. I told you that I would have a list of resources, and this is a really good list of resources. There's some books on here. I put the 2 movies on here. They both are available on Amazon. I've also got some websites that are listed. And then here's our information. I will have Jamie hop back on real quick to talk again about CEs.
Thank you, Holly. Yes, please. After you receive your follow-up email from Marty, there will be a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation. We do ask everybody complete the evaluation. Your feedback is valuable to us. But if you're wanting the CE credits for social work, nursing, licensed professional counselor, or a certificate of attendance, you must complete the evaluation. And the evaluation, the link do expire at the end of the day on October the 18th.
In addition to that, real quick, there'll also be a Google survey link. It should pop up when you close out of the webinar today, but if not, you'll also receive a link to that in the follow-up email. Please note, and I've just been seeing this a lot lately, please note that if you're logging into our webinars, to make sure you log in there with your own registration account, because if you're logging in under someone else's, we don't have a record of your attendance, and so we can't provide CEUs. I'm sorry, my phone. Sorry.
And here's the program we'll be doing next month, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we've got a few questions. But next month, I really encourage you to join us on November 14th for Holidays and Dementia, and we are going to cover all aspects of holidays and dementia. Not only will we give some great ideas for how to include a person with dementia in the holidays. But we will also have a gift guide for what is great ideas for gifts for people with dementia, gifts for caregivers of those with dementia, very normal feelings and emotions to have during the holidays. And it's just a really, really good program that we have developed over the years. It has grown from about a 30-minute program into a 90-minute program. So I encourage you to be with us next month to do holidays and dementia.
Very good. Very, very good.
All right, let me see questions that Jamie was not able to answer. Let me see.
There were some good questions.
The extended family, yes, that's true. Somebody mentioned the notebook. My only thing with the notebook, though, I actually watched it the other day, is that she tends to pop in and out of her dementia. That's the bad thing with the notebook, is that she seems to come completely out of her dementia at times. It's really good as far as the feelings and emotions and the heartbreak, boy, oh boy. But oh, thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate what you said. So when I was a social worker at a nursing home, I had a patient with dementia that was sexually inappropriate with other nonverbal patients. Well, after speaking with his son, the patient had a history of sexually violating his children. Handle that in a facility or a home. I've had something similar happen before, where I've actually had to refer people out to do some counseling, because boy, does this sometimes bring up some deep, dark, long hidden secrets, family issues. That's why I was talking about the trauma-informed care. I've certainly had to move residents before and put them into a different area or a different house or a different neighborhood or a different wing, unit, pod, whatever it is that you call them, because our first priority is going to be the safety of everybody who's there. And again, sometimes we have to go to that medication temporarily. I don't know that I've ever seen a case that we weren't able to make better. I'm not going to say we were able to fix 100%, but at least make better till we got through this phase or stage. Others, Jamie, let's see, how would you handle the situation of a female resident crawling into bed with other sexual expression if it upsets the other residents and or families? Again, that is one where if it's upsetting the other residents, and if it's upsetting the families, with the families who do a lot of education, but if it's also upsetting the other residents, then there may be where we have to move that person so they're not even able to get to, especially if they are targeting someone, because that will happen where they'll target somebody. Maybe it's reminding them of someone else, or that's the person they're going after. I've sure had to do that before, where we get them moved. And then maybe start to look into or using that journal. And again, in healthcare, we're going to be writing everything down anyway. What's going on? Do they start getting out and go into bed with somebody right after someone's just come in to change them, check on them, turned on the light? What are they watching before they go to bed? There's all different kinds of things to take into consideration also.
Those were really the questions that we had in the chat. So far, great program.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. If you think of anything else, or if there was just something that you didn't want to mention with anyone, you can email me. My email's on that very last slide. You can email Jamie. You can email Marty, and he'll get it to us. And we will always get back with you. If for some reason we don't, and you got caught in our filter, because it's been known to happen before, we've got a filter that'll catch some things sometimes, give us a call. We'll get back with you. We appreciate you also.
Hey, Holly and Jamie, again, just absolutely incredible. I filled out my nomination form and submitted it while you were presenting. And so I've not only done that, but I made a link to my nomination form, so you would have the information you would need to fill out the form. But I asked that obviously you use your own writing to write about Holly as you do
Oh
it.
my goodness. I didn't even know there was a nomination form.
There is a nomination form, and it takes some links, to it, which you should find in mine. But there's areas that you're going to talk about, Holly, and explain why this is a special person to do a TED Talk on these very, very interesting, complicated topics. And I included links to the last 2 webinars we've done.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
Please.
I truly didn't even know that was a thing.
I
thought I just had to nominate myself every time.
I just want you to know it will be there in the follow-up email as well as everything else.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. And again, Holly, Jamie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
See y'all
you.
next time.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.